morning, everyone. I guess we'll go ahead and get started with our first session of the day. Welcome to the Natural Resources session. Our first presenter up is Katie Boyer with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. Katie, I will give you the floor.
Sounds good. Thanks so much. Turning my video on here. Good morning, everybody. My name is Katie Boyer. I'm with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. I work remotely for our Southwest Regional Office based out of Austin, Texas, actually. And I have been working on monarch butterfly and pollinator conservation since 2015. I actually had the pleasure of speaking at an ITEC conference in 2016. So some of you all may remember me from then. But if not, I actually just switched into a new role this week as our at-risk species coordinator for Texas and Oklahoma. And so I'm looking forward to hopefully working with all of you in the future as well. So today I'm going to be talking to you a little bit about how we have been working together with a wide variety of partners to conserve monarch butterflies and other pollinators. So while many of the grains that we depend on for food are wind pollinated, many of the foods that we eat, of course, depend on animal pollinators. And most of these are foods that give our diet variety and flavor, of course. In the natural world, many trees and grasses are wind pollinated. However, 75% of all flowering plants need animal pollinators. And that includes everything from small plants and flowers to shrubs and vines and to even wild fruit trees. Without our pollinators, these plants could not produce seeds or their fruit, and they would eventually disappear because they could no longer reproduce, of course. Then consider all of the other organisms that depend on these plants for food and for shelter. So those too would eventually disappear if we didn't have our pollinators on the landscape. Some plants are actually in danger now of becoming extinct because they lack sufficient pollinators. Some plants and their animal pollinators develop such close evolutionary relationships that they cannot survive without one another. As a result, if the plant disappears, the pollinator cannot shift to another plant. And if the pollinator disappears, no other pollinator has the unique structures to feed on the plant and subsequently pollinate the plant. So they are very important to our ecosystems at large. There are a lot of different foods that require pollination. It's estimated that 1 of every 3 bites of food is the result of our pollinators. About 8% of our global crop production directly relies on all different types of pollinators. A recent report by the Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services estimates that the annual value of global crops affected by pollination is between $235 and $577 billion. So a huge contribution to our economy, given the way that they help produce our foods. Tree fruits like apples, peaches, and oranges, as well as tomatoes and chili peppers, and nuts like almonds and cashews are all in part the result of pollination. Chocolate also depends on pollinators, specifically a small midge fly. And we also have pollinators to thank for our tequila, so they're important across the board. Ultimately, pollinators are responsible for helping produce more than 180,000 different plant species and over 1,200 different crops. Pollination, aside from that, provides many ecosystem services that support the health of plants, people, and the planet. For example, they can help improve biodiversity by facilitating the reproduction of native and diverse plant species that provide food and shelter for many different birds and mammals and insects. The roots of pollinated plants also bind to soil and rock particles, helping to hold the soil together during floods, windstorms, and landslides. Thus, it reduces erosion. Additionally, as pollinated plants die and decay, this organic matter provides nutrients for the next generation of life and really improves soil health. So these are just a few of the different types of ecosystem services that pollination provides for us. And this was actually chosen as the theme of the 2020 Pollinator Partnership poster shown here that kind of just shows all of the different types of benefits that pollinators provide. Monarch butterflies are just one of the many different types of pollinators, but they've kind of become the poster child for pollinator conservation over the last 5 to 7 years, I would say. So that's what I'm going to focus on here today. So monarchs go through a complete metamorphosis that takes about a month to complete, and that includes 4 life stages. First the egg, then the larva, then the chrysalis or pupa, and then the adult. Adults lay eggs on milkweed plants like you see here. That's an antelope horn milkweed, which is native to Texas. And when they lay their eggs, it's usually underneath a leaf or on the stem of the plant, but it can also be on the flower or anywhere. These eggs take about 2 to 5 days to hatch into larvae. And the first thing the larvae generally does is eat the egg casing. And then it really starts mowing down the milkweed plant over the 2 weeks that it's in this larval caterpillar stage. During this time, caterpillars eat and grow very rapidly. They actually grow 2,000 times their original mass in about 9 to 18 days, which is the equivalent of a human infant growing to the size of an adult elephant in about 2 weeks. Once they're ready to pupate, they'll find a safe place, likely a few meters away from their milkweed plant that they've eaten down, possibly a windowsill or a bench if you're in a garden setting. Otherwise, it might be on another plant, somewhere where there's a little bit of shelter. They will then spin a silk button with the spinneret, which is located beneath the mandibles, and it'll hang upside down from its abdomen to shed its skin one last time and create its chrysalis. So that process, once it hangs in this upside down J shape, it might be like that for about 24 hours before it sheds its skin that last time, like you see in these photos here, and becomes this green and gold chrysalis that is very familiar to many folks who worked on monarchs. And it stays in that pupa or chrysalis for about 2 weeks. And once it's ready, that signature orange and black pigmentation of the adult butterfly will start to show through that chrysalis. And that's the very last thing that develops before the monarch is ready to eclose or emerge from the pupa casing. So once it's ready to eclose, this process happens very quickly. It takes only about 30 to 60 seconds for the monarch to open the casing and make its way out. But when it first comes out, it looks pretty small and deformed like what you see here. It actually will hang there and pump its abdomen to release liquid into its wings to make them expand to their full size. And it'll hang upside down for 4 to 6 hours from there to really let its wings dry and harden. It's still relatively fragile for about 24 to 48 hours after it's eclosed, but they can start flying around as soon as their wings have hardened. Generally speaking, there are 2 populations of monarch butterflies in North America, and they're separated by the Rocky Mountains. So throughout Oklahoma, Texas, Louisiana, the monarchs that you see are part of the eastern migratory population that spends its winters down in the Oyamel fir forest in Mexico in the states of Michoacan and the state of Mexico. When the temperature starts to rise, then the days start to get a little bit longer. Monarchs become more active and begin to travel northward in the spring, mating and seeking out milkweed plants upon which to lay their eggs. Texas tends to be their first stop once they've reached the United States in late March and April, and then they start to expand up into Oklahoma, Louisiana. You might get them a little later on, April or May timeframe. These monarchs that have lived 6 to 9 months over the winter in Mexico lay their eggs before they die. And those eggs go through a complete metamorphosis, emerging as adult butterflies in just about a month's time. They continue to travel northward and along the coast, seeking out those milkweed plants, and generally they arrive in the Midwest, northern United States, northeastern United States, and up into Canada by the middle of summer. In August and September, When the temperatures start to drop a little bit and the days start to get a little bit shorter up north, the monarchs start flying back southward to return to their overwintering grounds in Mexico. So during those fall months, it's really important as monarchs fly through our part of the country that they have abundant flowering nectar sources to feed on to fuel that migration. I think some of you folks are in New Mexico, which may get monarchs from both the eastern and the western population. Just wanted to mention that there. The western monarchs overwinter in about 400 different sites along the California coastline, and they do have a migratory journey as well. It's just slightly different than what we see in this eastern population. And some eastern butterflies are in New Mexico as well. It's just less clear exactly where the monarchs are coming from in Arizona and New Mexico in particular. When they're down in Mexico, they cluster together and form a shingle-like structure like what you see in the photo here. And they're in such high densities that they can turn the whole forest orange like you see in that top photo there. So when monarchs are in the US over the spring, summer, and fall, you can find them in habitat of all different shapes and sizes and locations. They're opportunistic, and generally they're going to seek out habitats that have the resources they need. So the milkweed plant necessary for their caterpillars to feed on, and then abundant nectar plants, which are what the adult butterflies feed on. So when it comes to conserving monarchs, those are the two main components that you need to be thinking about. And as the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service works on all different types of species issues, but it's really rare that we're in a situation where somebody can help us with conservation of a declining species in their own backyard, even with a container garden or along, also along rights of way, on rooftop gardens, even in city parks, any kind of green spaces. So all different shapes and sizes of habitat really provides a unique opportunity for everyone to get engaged in monarch conservation. Monarchs do occur all over the world, but about 90% of their global population is a part of the North American population. So this eastern migratory population, their size is estimated by looking at the area the monarchs occupy in their wintering grounds in Mexico when they're gathered in such high densities. This population has been systematically censused annually since 1994, and the results are what you see here on this graph. So of note, in the winter of 1996 to 1997, that's this orange peak here, monarchs were occupying about 45 acres down in Mexico. And in 2013 to 2014, that winter, they dropped to their all-time low of only occupying about 1.65 acres. All of the monarchs in that eastern migratory population throughout the whole eastern US, only in 1.6 acres over the course of that winter. So that really spurred an international movement to help conserve the species. And we've seen a slight uptick since then, though this last year they were down to about 2 hectares, unfortunately, which is about 5 acres of forest down in Mexico. And that's a 26% decrease from the prior year. So still continue to be concerned about our monarchs. The Western population has also seen a similar decline. For this population, the size is estimated by counting monarchs along the West Coast over a 3-week period that's known as the Western Monarch Thanksgiving Count. This year's overwintering population estimate for the Western monarch is only 1,914 butterflies, 1,914. That's why you don't even see a little green bar here for 2020. The estimated Western population was at least 4.5 million in the 1980s. And for the last 3 years, the overwintering population estimate was less than about 300,000 butterflies, or 30,000 butterflies, which is a 99.5% decline in the population since the 80s. So this is a huge decline. Especially when compared to 20 years ago when the count was initiated and was approximately 1.2 million monarchs here. And we have growing concern about the status of our Western migratory population. The primary drivers affecting the health of our two North American migratory populations are changes in breeding, migratory, and overwintering habitat, continued exposure to pesticides, and then also the effects of climate change. Habitat loss throughout the breeding grounds has occurred due to land use changes, urban and suburban expansion, widespread use of pesticides, and development. Our prime historical habitat for monarchs, which was always our native grasslands, has declined, and these grasslands are considered the least conserved and most altered landscapes on Earth, according to the Nature Conservancy. It's estimated that over 1.3 billion stems of milkweed have been lost, impacting the monarch's ability to reproduce, of course. In Mexico, habitat loss is occurring at the overwintering grounds due to things like illegal logging. And in California, the overwintering grounds are impacted by unsuitable management as well. Climate change and weather extremes are also affecting migration and survival, including at the overwintering grounds. And then insecticides also negatively impact pollinators, including our monarchs. So as a result of all of the concern about how low those monarch numbers were in 2013-2014, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service received a petition to list the monarch as threatened on August 26th of 2014, and that initiated a regulatory process. On December 31st of 2014, we released what's called a positive 90-day finding, which essentially just said the petition was substantial. It contains enough information for us to determine that looking into it further through a 12-month status review is appropriate. Through an agreement with the original petitioners, we were able to extend our deadline for when we were going to release that 12-month finding, and we actually just published that in December of 2020, just this past winter. So on December 15th, we announced a 12-month finding, and based on a thorough review of the species status, the Fish and Wildlife Service determined that listing is warranted, but a proposal to list the monarch is precluded at this time by higher priority listing actions. This just means we're going to add the monarch to the National Listing Work Plan. And based on our listing priorities and workload, we intend to propose the monarch in fiscal year 2024 if listing remains warranted at that time. Because the monarch is now considered a candidate species, we'll review its status every year to ensure that priority is appropriate. But currently, there are listing actions for 161 species on the work plan that are a higher priority than the monarch. And this is in part because there has been so much robust conservation efforts that are continuing for the monarch and helping us address the threats that the species is facing. So now is really the time to continue to build on this momentum and continue our work to try to bolster the population. If we want to get to a point where we don't have to list the species under the Endangered Species Act, it's really going to take everyone pitching in with conservation on the ground, whether it's in your backyard or on tribal lands or in your communities. We need everybody working together to ensure a future filled with monarchs. So as the monarchs have declined, a tremendous movement to recover them has gained momentum. And we've been working across a wide variety of our partners to try to bring back the monarchs. I'm sure many of you have been engaged in this work. I know a lot of our tribes in Oklahoma have been doing great things for monarchs for many years. But if you're new to this effort, we're also excited for the potential to work with you as well and hope you will join us in these efforts. For the past 5 years, there's been 4 major focuses for the monarch efforts, and these are the 4 listed here. So restoring and enhancing monarch habitat, propagating seeds to address the shortage of native seeds that in some cases can limit our habitat enhancement projects, conducting research and monitoring in order to better understand the declines for the species and how to help them, and then engaging communities and partners to synergize our monarch conservation efforts. The U.S. goal set forth for the eastern population of monarchs is guided by the Monarch Conservation Science Partnership, And that goal is to reach a 10-year average population size of 6 hectares or 15 acres occupied at the overwintering grounds in Mexico. So that's this green line that you see across the graph here. This is estimated to be the historical average of the area occupied at the overwintering grounds. And we want to look for a 10-year average population size at this mark to account for the fact that insect populations really rise and fall pretty dramatically on a regular basis. So note that in 2018 to 2019, we hit this number for the first time. That was a very wet year. We had good floral resources and the timing was right for the monarchs. So it was a good year and we need more of those. To accomplish this goal, it's projected that we need between 1.3 and 1.8 billion additional milkweed stems across the breeding range. So as a result of that, the the Midwest Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies created the Mid-America Monarch Conservation Strategy. And this is numerous state fish and wildlife agencies who have worked together to create this plan over the next 20 years to try to conserve monarchs. In this dark purple area in the Midwest, where monarchs tend to be during the summer months, there is a planting goal of 1.3 billion additional stems of milkweed over the next 20 years in that particular area. And in our part of the world, in this lighter purple area, which is known as the South Core for the monarch, the planting goal is less clear, but we know that we need to focus not just on the milkweed, but also on nectar resources. And that's in part because of that fall migration through our part of the world when monarchs are headed down to Mexico and really need to build up their lipid reserves so that they can live for the 6 to 9 months that they'll be there. A study was conducted to evaluate which land cover sectors we should focus on when we think about habitat creation and enhancement to achieve this goal. And it assessed the present and potential ability to support milkweed in each of the land use sectors you see here. So marginal agriculture lands, urban and suburban lands, protected grasslands, conservation reserve program lands, and rights of way as well. In assessing a variety of future scenarios for milkweed in each of these different sectors, this study ultimately found that we could achieve the desired outcome of the added milkweed stems only if we added milkweed in all 5 land use sectors. This means we need all sectors engaged and working together in an all hands on deck scenario. Conservation efforts that incorporate milkweed along with grassland cover and diverse nectar resources really can help ensure a stable monarch population and also provide important benefits for other species and additional ecosystem services. Since we originally received the petition to list the monarch, conservation efforts have occurred all over the place. It's the efforts of folks like all of you who are banding together to create habitat and contribute to research that are really helping save the species. So the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service created the Monarch Conservation Database so that we could gather information on all the different efforts going on across the landscape. This is the primary tool we use to gauge the magnitude of completed, implemented, and planned conservation efforts since 2014 when we were petitioned to list the species. These figures, these numbers that you see here are the totals that we had as of December 2020. So over 48,000 conservation efforts benefiting 5.6 million acres of habitat and creating about 491 million milkweed stems. Amazing work happening out there, and we need to continue to build off of that. So how can you help? Well, you can help by creating habitat, and that just includes planting milkweed and nectar plants that are going to bloom throughout the entire growing season, so spring, summer, and fall. You can also incorporate best management practices on your lands that can include reducing pesticide use, changing mowing regimes, that type of management. And then also engaging in citizen science is a really solid way to get involved. And I'll talk a little bit more about that. So when it comes to creating habitat, there are numerous resources available that can help you determine what to plant. Pollinator Partnership has regional guides for farmers, land managers, and gardeners that are excellent resources. They include details on site considerations, pollinator plant preferences, and site maintenance. The Xerces Society for Invertebrate Conservation also has regional resources that include habitat establishment guides, local seed vendors, and best of the lists of native plants for each state and region. These are awesome resources as well. The Lady Bird Johnson Wildflower Center also is a wealth of information on native plants, including those for pollinators. They have collaborated with the Xerces Society to create lists of plants that are of special value, not just to monarchs, but also bumblebees, native bees, honeybees. So great information there. And then the National Wildlife Federation also has a native plant finder. You can type in your zip code and see plant species that are recommended based on a score of the number of butterfly and moth species that use them. So kind of a cool tool to look into as well. And then also a great resource worth mentioning is Monarch Watch's free milkweed for restoration projects website that you see here. So they accept applications for folks who are looking to restore habitat on over 2 acres throughout the range of the eastern monarch. So great way to get some milkweed for your project. When it comes to pollinator gardens, you really want to stick to choosing plants with different flowering times, like I mentioned, spring, summer, fall. You want to plant in clusters and kind of have just at least a few of each of your species that you include there. You want to provide a variety of different colors and shapes to attract all different pollinators, not just monarchs, of course. And then you really want to make sure that you eliminate or limit your pesticide use, because that can be harmful to all of our insect visitors. And then choose native plants is critical here as well. Those are going to attract our native pollinators. They're better sources of nectar and pollen, and they're a great food source for caterpillars. When it comes to restoring habitat, the principles are similar to those for restoring habitat in natural areas. Is similar to planting pollinator gardens. You ultimately need to remove invasive species and give the native plants an opportunity to thrive. This can include removing the overstory from patches within forested areas or dense shrub through brush removal. Our Partners for Fish and Wildlife program does a lot of this type of work in order to restore or enhance habitat for monarchs. Prescribed fire is an excellent management tool that can help encourage the native seed bank to be restored and have abundant flowering nectar sources on the landscape as well. That's probably the most effective management tool where I live in Texas to benefit habitat for monarchs. I'm going to cruise through the next couple of slides just to wrap up here. So there's a lot of different ways you can engage in citizen science efforts for monarch butterflies. These are some of the programs here. These are great ways to engage your community. So tagging events in the fall when monarchs are on their way down to Mexico, you can actually put these little stickers on the butterfly, and they have a 6-digit code that you see here. You enter the data of where you put that tag on your butterfly into a database, and then the monarchs in Mexico, folks in Mexico go and look for tagged butterflies, and they can then see from the database where those monarchs came from. So great way to engage. There's also Journey North, where you can log your viewings of monarchs or milkweed. We have the Monarch Larva Monitoring Project, which is really about looking at milkweed density and monarch larvae using milkweeds. And Project Monarch Health, led out of the University of Georgia, checks monarchs for different parasites that affect them. And then lastly, the All-Star program is the Integrated Monarch Monitoring Program, which kind of combines elements of all of the other programs for more intensive monitoring of monarchs and their habitat. So the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service is really using our work on monarchs to expand the scope into a national effort on pollinator conservation. I am leading our national pollinator partnerships team, and so we are actively looking for partners who want to engage in novel projects to benefit pollinators. If you are interested, I'm going to put my contact information up here in just a second, and I hope you will get in touch with me because it's something I would love to work on with all of you. Our vision moving forward is a diverse community working together to conserve landscapes where pollinators thrive for the benefit of nature and for people. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to my contact information here. I also just quickly want to mention there's more information available at the links posted here. Okies for Monarchs is a great Oklahoma group that might have local resources if you are located there. And then I have to mention the Tribal Alliance for Pollinators that many of you may have heard of, started by Jane Breckenridge at the Muskogee Creek Nation. Amazing resource, amazing trainings that she hosts throughout the country at this point, and you can access their information at the website there. So awesome information to look into there as well. But feel free to contact me, and I don't know if we have any time for questions I might have gone over. So turning it back to you, Karen.
Thank you, Katie. I don't see any questions in the chat box. And I wanted to mention for those of you that are calling in, if you have any questions, you can email them to me and I will send them over to Katie. Katie, if you want to check your chat box really quick, just to make sure you don't have any in yours.
Nope, nothing over here.
Okay, if you want to stop sharing your screen, we'll move on to the next presenter. Thank you, Katie.
Thank you.
Okay, our next presenter up is Allison Smart, and Allison is with Little River Band of Ottawa Indians. Allison, I will give you the floor.
Good morning, everyone. Let me get this shared here.
I can see your, yep.
There we go.
Looks good, thank you.
Yep. So first of all, I have to say thank you to Karen to invite me to come talk today. And when Karen asked me if I could present today, I was trying to think of a topic that is pertinent to things that are going on right now here in Michigan. And I'm the Environmental Division Manager for the Little River Band of Ottawa Indians. We are located in Manistee, Michigan, which on this slide is the yellow dot. So we're right on the coast of Lake Michigan. And we are one of the tribes that have a ceded territory and reserved rights through treaties. And so real quick, I want to address that we're one of 5 tribes who are signatories to the 1836 Treaty of Washington. And I'm going to go into some detail today on how those treaty rights impact our natural resources programs and our environmental programs, and then talk about some of the work we're doing both on reservation and in the ceded territories. So really, in order to tell this story, I have to go back in time. And so I'm going to jump back to 1835. So this is a year before, 2 years before the state of Michigan was recognized as a state in the Union. And at this time, the 1836 ceded territory area was occupied by several different bands of Odawa and Chippewa or Ojibwe Indians. Pretty much at this point, my family was actually hanging out in Sault Ste. Marie, Michigan, and Ontario. I'm a citizen of the Sault Ste. Marie tribe of Chippewa Indians. And basically, in order for Michigan to become a state after the Battle of Toledo, the state had to get the tribes to cede the northern part of Michigan, the northern part of the Lower Peninsula of Michigan, the eastern part of the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. So the settlers wanted to see the tribes removed. And the tribes were then convinced to send delegations to Washington, even though they wanted to do the negotiations in Detroit. So at this time, in 1835, tribal leaders from these bands and the tribes in these areas traveled to Washington. And as part of that, they ceded around 13.8 million acres of land in Michigan. But the key to this treaty, there were two major keys. One was the tribes thought and left Washington thinking that they were going to be able to stay on these reservations for perpetuity. There's a little switcheroo that happened, and the 1836 treaty actually says 5 years. That got figured out later in later treaties and later conversations. But for the Little River Band of Ottawa Indians, they were granted 70,000 acre reservation along the Big Manistee River. And as part of ceding those lands, currently that 13.8 million acres of Michigan is about 30% of that land mass for the state. The key to this treaty, though, is in Article 13. Article 13 gave the rights for the hunting, gathering, and all of those other occupancy issues for land that was not deemed needed for settlement. So on May 28th, in 1836, the treaty was signed. On January 26th, in 1837, Michigan became a state. So our treaty rights predate the state of Michigan. In order to understand how all of this treaty and all of this history impacts what we do today in our Natural Resources Department, it's really digging into the history of those Article 13 rights. So I'm going to skip several hundred years and jump forward into the 1980s. So in order to talk about our treaty rights and how we got to how we are where we are at today, we've got to talk about our consent decrees. So to go back, 1836, the Treaty of Washington signed. In 1860, the Bay Mills Reservation was established by Congress. In 1974, the Sault Ste. Marie tribe gained federal recognition. And then our awesome fishermen come into play. This is Big Abe LeBlanc, and he is a lot of times the hero of our story. In the 70s, he basically called the state of Michigan and said, hey, I'm going to go set gill net in Lake Superior. And he finally gets arrested, finally gets the ticket, and the state Supreme Court ruled that the state could only limit the tribal fishery if it endangers the fishery in the Great Lakes region. So what this means is that it then went through a lot of appeals process, and the Fox decision is the big decision that ruled in favor of treaty rights for the Great Lakes fishery in 1979. In 81, the Supreme Court declined review. And in 1981, the Chippewa-Ottawa Treaty Fisheries Resource Authority, or COFMA, is established. In 84, GTB, or the Grand Traverse Bands of Ottawa and Chippewa, gained their federal recognition. In 85, the First Lake Consent Order, which was ordered by the courts to allow for the tribes to fish in the Great Lakes commercially and subsistently under tribal jurisdiction, was signed. 1994, this is where Little River and Little Traverse Bay bands come in, and they gain federal recognition in a joint act of Congress. In 98, Little River joined COFMA. In 2000, COFMA became CORA, and a 20-year consent decree between CORA, the state of Michigan, and the U.S. was signed. At this time, Little Traverse joined CORA. So now we're 5 members strong in CORA. After this nightmare of negotiations in 2000, in 2007, the state and the tribes came together and said, okay, let's have a conversation about inland rights, because we took care of the Great Lakes stuff, we got that taken care of. So they negotiated the 2007 Inland Consent Decree. So this gives our tribal citizens the ability to hunt, fish, and gather on state land, tribal land, private land, if they have appropriate permission or they own the land, as well as federal land, U.S. Forest Service land within the ceded territories. And pretty much any waterway, as long as it's not completely enclosed by private land, in the 13.8 million acres of ceded territories. It also allows us to do restoration work and help promote species conservation and area conservation for wetlands in these areas. In 2020, our current consent decree is expired for the Great Lakes. That consent decree is in the process of being renegotiated right now. So to give an idea of where these areas are, the non-disputed area is for the lakes where tribal citizens of these 5 tribes can do commercial and subsistence fishing is in blue. So that runs up against both the Canadian and Wisconsin border in different areas with the state of Michigan. And this is the area where members can hunt, fish, and gather in inland areas. So when you think about the environment and you think about human health in the environment and you think about different species being harvested, we have to expand outside of that area that is the 1830 or is our reservation, which is located down in Manistee, and we're often dealing with potential issues to the environment hundreds of miles away. So this ceded territory right is the backbone of our natural resources department. It leads to funding, projects, and collaboration that we wouldn't be able to do otherwise due to a lot of jurisdictional issues. It also can change our interactions with our federal and state partners when we start talking about trust responsibility. It has helped us build capacity in our natural resources programs. This is a timeline showing that from reaffirmation to today, where we are at as a natural resources department. And so we have grown in 30 years very quickly, and we actually have a fairly large staff for a tribal natural resources department, which allows us to do a lot, but we really still have to focus on collaboration in order to have an idea of what's going on, both on reservation and within the ceded territory. Currently, we have funding from a lot of sources. Our tribal government funding is actually our smallest pot right now. Most of our money comes from whether it's US EPA or BIA through the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative. We also receive funding as part of the consent decrees that's called Rights Protection Implementation Funds, and that allows us to both do law enforcement and have conservation officers within the ceded territories doing the police work, making sure membership are following the laws of the tribe while out harvesting and gathering. And then also to allow us to protect those rights through different projects, different type of work we're doing. We are currently up to 17 full-time staff. 5 of those are in the environmental division that I oversee. And really, I want to touch on our program overviews, because now that you have the background, you have an idea of how we got from 1836 to today, it really digs into how much work we're actually doing. The first division I'm going to talk about today is wildlife. Their main focus is protecting the right to hunt and a little bit of gathering through the 1836 ceded territory. A lot of their work is done under the 2007 Inland Consent Decree, and currently they're using pine marten as an indicator species for old growth forest health, as well as other different indicators, specifically around climate change. That's where our turtle projects and our snowshoe hare come in. That understanding that how climate change is impacting these species, some of which are still harvested by members, whether it is snowshoe hare through hunting and trapping, or turtles through hunting and actually a little bit of trapping on that, as well as loon. So a lot of our wildlife department right now is focused on looking at those indicator species for habitat health, for larger species that we're working with. A piece of their work is also to go up and monitor different type of hunting. In the top photo is a photo of an elk that was taken by a tribal citizen. This elk is part of the annual Michigan elk hunt. Tribes get a certain percentage of the tags, so our biologists go up, they help go through an assessment of elk after they're taken in collaboration with our public safety department. One of the more important pieces is our Great Lakes fishery. These guys are out on Lake Michigan performing annual Great Lakes assessment surveys for the fishery. So we use a small mesh gill net to capture lake trout, whitefish, and local management units to do population estimates. So we're part of that wider collaboration with the state and federal government on understanding fisheries populations in the Great Lakes. They also work with our commercial and subsistence fishermen on permitting, talking to them about what's going on in the fishery, gaining that knowledge. On top of all of this, they're doing larval whitefish and juvenile lake sturgeon assessments, as well as Cisco assessments. And I'm going to touch really closely on our lake sturgeon program in a little bit and the importance of that program to our tribal community. Inland fisheries, touching real quick on this guy before I jump into lake sturgeon. A lot of the focus of our inland fisheries on assessment within the 1836 inland ceded territory. So they are out there looking at walleye population, different species of trout, and salmon, which are often the chosen fish to be harvested by tribal citizens. We have a walleye spearing season where tribal fishermen are out at night spearing walleye. So really our focus is making sure that our populations are safe for the amount that are being taken via spear during spawning season, as well as making sure that the population is growing and that we don't need to restrict harvest. So a lot of that works there, but then we also tie in some water quality into that work. One of their biggest projects they're working on right now is the reintroduction of grayling, Arctic grayling, into the Michigan waters. This is a collaboration between the state of Michigan and the tribes in the 1836 ceded territory. And our fisheries team is one of the leads on that project. So they're doing a lot of cool work with that. And we're hoping to have grayling in Michigan waters again by 2025, 2026. We work very closely with our fisheries and our inland fisheries staff to work on several of our water quality assessments to use fish as IBI indicators or as indices to whether or not we have good water quality in our system. The next big one I want to talk about is our lake sturgeon program, and this is one people are always really excited to hear about. Our tribe has our own lake sturgeon management plan. Neme is a very important species to the Little River community, and a lot of work, time, and energy has been invested in rehabbing the manatee population of lake sturgeon. So back in the early 2000s, we came up with the idea, our staff at the time came up with the idea to have a portable rearing facility for lake sturgeon. Lake sturgeon are known to imprint. So the water, their natal water system is where they go back to spawn when they're adults, and they're a long-lived species. In the first 13 years of the program, we've raised and released over 1,000 lake sturgeon. And this process is a long, complicated process, and I was fortunate to work on this project and this program before I became the environmental division manager. So we use different methods. We don't force fish to spawn. We actually throw egg bots in the water to capture eggs, as well as catch fish when they're drifting downstream. This is minimally invasive on the fish when they are going to spawn up the river. We pit tag, or the same tag you put in a dog or a cat, that same tag we put in lake sturgeon so we can identify them later in life as either hatchery reared fish or wild caught fish. We do a release every year. This is a community event where we bring the community together. We often tie in other programs we're working on to the release with tables talking about whether it's our water quality program, which works in the Big Manistee River, or our wildlife program. We just have those conversations. So it's this huge community event where we bring both native and non-native people together to celebrate the annual release of lake sturgeon. In 2017, we began to assess the adult population of lake sturgeon that are coming up the Manistee River to spawn. This includes using ultrasound techniques to identify whether or not they're male or female, which again, how minimally invasive to these fish can we be as they are a clan animal. We've tagged close to, now it's actually close to 500 that were wild fish that were able to survive to that critical young of year size to get them to release, and we were able to tag those as well. Currently, because of the high alkalinity in the Big Manistee River, we are conducting juvenile assessments right before sea lamprey treatments to pull fish out of the water, move them to our awesome rearing facility, and hold them until after the sea lamprey treatment goes through. This is a great combination of preventing invasive species and fighting the fight against invasive species while also protecting a state threatened species in Michigan. Finally, I want to touch base on our environmental programs. This is the area where I spend most of my time now, as well as the area where we're doing a lot of good work both on reservation and the ceded territory. Right now, we have actually 6 different programs that are funded through either EPA funds or EPA funds that pass through the Bureau of Indian Affairs Regional Office. This is my one slide where I talk about the different things we're doing with IDAP, and a lot of our focus right now is on ceded territory permit issues to protect human health and the environment in areas where our tribal citizens are harvesting as well as on a reservation. We're also working on some solid waste and trying to push through some different environmental laws internally that help protect human health and the environment on a reservation. So this is where we really dig down into our areas where we have fee and trust land. This is our Manistee Reservation. As you can see, this is actually an unrecognized exterior reservation boundary. That gets it gets really complicated here when we start talking about our reservation because our legislation didn't affirm the boundaries but didn't take them away. So for reaffirmation, a lot of times we're talking about our 1836 reservation. It's just not recognized as Indian country by the federal government. We also have some parcels that are in trust in Mason County that are part of that second treaty in 1855. These parcels are there. We don't really do much with them, and we actually don't have any EPA TAS down on them. And finally, we're expanding down into Muskegon County where we have a large population of tribal citizens. This area is mainly going to be used for economic development in another large population. So I do like to share these lands because we are doing a lot of great work down there, and we're moving some health clinics and some offices down there as well. So really to dig into it, Manistee is an industrial area, historically industrial, historically for logging and various salt mining industries as well as other industry. And our brownfields program right now is focused on figuring out what properties needed to be cleaned up for redevelopment. In the past, we've done 2 different cleanups. One was on a trust parcel and one was on a fee parcel. One formerly housed our Natural Resources Department offices and continued to house all of our equipment. And the other one is actually now our powwow grounds. Right now, we're working on identifying other sites for cleanup, as well as working on some open dump issues. The open dump we actually fund via GAP and IHS funding, but it is something that we tie into that work of basic overview of what sites need to be cleaned up. We have a lead arsenic problem due to old orchards in the area. Air quality. Right now, we are monitoring PM 2.5 and ozone. We actually have a really great collaboration with the state of Michigan on this, and we are intending to move forward with our TAS application hopefully this year. I can finally say that I'm pretty sure it's going in this year for air quality. The next big program, which is my biggest program that combines working in ceded territories and working on reservation water quality, is our wild rice and wetland program. Currently, we're monitoring and assessing our wild rice populations that are off reservation and on reservation. And then we're also working with the U.S. Forest Service, which is our next door neighbor for a lot of our sites, on finding areas to restore that we can protect long term from herbicide applications. We're looking at seed source viability, and also we're doing a lot of monitoring of our wetlands on reservation to understand where they're at now, so we can move forward, whether it's climate change, redevelopment, other issues on protecting the pharmacies of the tribe. Our water program is probably our largest program that we have. We currently are monitoring 4 streams, six lake sites, and 7 river sites along the Big Manistee River corridor. We were recently invited to take part in the Attains pilot, so we're really excited to get our data in Attains to talk about our restrictions and our health for our tribal citizens within the Big Manistee River. This is going to be important to move things forward and help us identify areas that we could maybe tie in some 319 work on decreasing erosion and other issues within the Big Manistee River watershed. Currently, our first big project is underway with some bank restoration on one of our tributaries to the Big Manistee River, and that construction starts in the next 2 days here. So we're super excited to watch that program move forward and be able to talk more about these projects that we're doing under that 319 funding. So this is just a photo of whether we're doing education and outreach with our local high school or out just monitoring our bugs or general water quality on reservation. And it's a lot of that background work to building the program up. So I know it feels like sometimes I'm all over the place when I talk about this, but the big thing I want to hit home today is the importance of protecting the environment and the habitat within the ceded territory and on reservation. For tribes who have those ceded territory areas, we have very limited ways to truly actually protect those off-reservation resources. And they're critical to protecting human health and the environment in our tribal populations. Because an example I like to use is myself with this. As a Sault Ste. Marie tribal member, I'm not hunting, fishing, and gathering up in the eastern Upper Peninsula. Because of the ceded territory, I'm actually hunting, fishing, and gathering where I live under tribal permit and jurisdiction. So the fish I harvest in Manistee County under tribal jurisdiction, those same fish, if my tribe isn't able to protect those fish, we have issues. The health of those fish, whether they're loaded with mercury, PCBs, PFAS, all of those things are where the core tribes have to work together to have a better understanding of what's going on in our environment. And the inability to, other than through comment periods and formal consultation, which can be questionable at times with the state, with our state partners, we have a lot of different issues going on that could cause large-scale pollution, impacts to the environment, and long-term impacts to the ability of tribal citizens to hunt, fish, and gather, which is a lifeway. So without clean habitat, safe environments, there won't be fish and deer to eat and medicines to collect. And without being able to do that, and our environment being destroyed, we impact our human health and the ability for tribal citizens to practice their lifeways. So that's my take-home message today. And so using the capacity we've built with EPA funding, using the capacity we've built through rights protection and implementation funding, we hope to better protect our environment and the human health of our tribal citizens over that large scale area, because our issues run outside fee to trust reservation boundaries. They run to 13.8 million acres of lands in Michigan and much of the Great Lakes that are considered in that area. So with that, I'm more than happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Allison. I don't see any in the chat box just yet. You might want to check yours just to make sure there's not any in yours just yet. And if you guys think of questions after the fact, you can send them to me and I'll be glad to forward them on to the presenters. Are there any chats in your chat box, Allison?
I do not see any.
Okay. Okay, with that, we'll move on to our next presenter. Thank you so much, Allison. Our next presenter is Kayla Bowe with the Red Lake Nation. I'm sending you presenter privileges, Kayla, sorry. So you should be able to share your screen.
Okay, let me.
Starting to share. Yep, we see it.
Give it a second here. There, now do you see my title slide?
Yes.
Okay, great. All right, well, good morning. Thanks to Karen for inviting me to speak today. My name is Kayla Bowe. I work as a biologist with the Red Lake Band Department of Natural Resources in the Water Resources Program. Today I'm going to be talking to you a little bit about restoring connectivity and reducing sedimentation in some of our Red Lake Nation streams. Maybe. Trying to advance. There we go. Okay, so today I'll give you a little history of Red Lake to help you understand where we're located and what we do, and then I'll go over some example projects, talk about some partnerships, and how we've measured success with these projects, both biological, using mussels, fish, and vertebrates, as well as looking at chemical nutrient analyses, and then go over any questions. And I'm not doing any video today, so there's a picture of me. So Red Lake, we're located in north central Minnesota, way up north, bordering Canada. And I'll zoom in a little into our trouble advancing. Very slow on my end, I apologize. So the yellow dashed line there is our 1863 treaty boundary, and within that is the restored ceded lands that we monitor, as well as the diminished reservation we refer to here. That portion was never ceded to the government, and all of that land is held in common by band members. So the Red Lake Reservation contains approximately 850,000 acres of trust land. We stretch more than 125 miles north to south and 115 miles east to west. It includes Red Lake, which is over 288,000 acres, and we stretch into the northwest angle located up here. I'll talk about that a little bit more in a couple slides. So our program, the Water Resources Program specifically, like I mentioned, we have Upper and Lower Red Lake. Upper Red Lake, the eastern portion is managed by the state of Minnesota, but we collaborate on data analysis and water quality monitoring, and so our sample sites extend into the state portion. That red boundary is the diminished reservation boundary. So we monitor Red Lake, over 135 small lakes. We sample each year 25 sites 4 times per open water season, and those lakes range anywhere from 5 to 500 acres in size. And then we do a rotation to account for those additional lakes that aren't sampled every year. We focus on the primary, those 24 sites are the higher priority sites for our band members. And then over 371 miles of rivers and streams. We sample at 16 locations in this region. This is just a zoomed in version of below Lower Red Lake and the expanse of small lakes that we sample there. And then I mentioned the northwest angle. That's located on Lake of the Woods. If you're not familiar with Lake of the Woods, it's a trans-boundary body of water. Shares the border between the U.S. and Canada. So we are dealing with the provinces of Manitoba and Ontario, as well as the state of Minnesota, the Red Lake Nation, and First Nations and Métis of Canada. The tribal ownership of the northwest angle is about 70% that the Red Lake Nation has, and that's why we have an interest there. It's used for hunting, berry picking. There's a great expanse of wild rice located there, and then the fishery of the lake. So we monitor 7 stream sites and 2 open water sites during the open water season, usually 4 times per year. So now that you know a little bit about us, I'm going to cover the example projects. So the problem we've had, we had several poorly designed culverts or undersized culverts located on some of these forest roads. And we would experience frequent washouts every spring or during any high storm event. And this would cause sedimentation issues downstream, poor habitat for fish and invertebrates and mussels. And then our other issue was a large dam, which I will talk about. So this initial project that got all of these other projects started was the removal of the Mud River Dam. So this dam was built in the town of Redby in the 1920s as a water source for the Red Lake fish hatchery, but the DO was too low and the water was too warm, so it wasn't really a viable source of water. And in 2009, the Red Lake Band was contacted by the Minnesota Department of Transportation that they wanted to move the road because they had an easement. This is a state highway that travels through the reservation. And they either needed to move the road or do structural improvements or a complete removal. And we looked at this as an opportunity to remove the dam because it would improve the water quality, it would restore fish passage, it would improve dam safety. And so this project had a wealth of partners, and it was very important to build these relationships. And since this project, we've been able to work with all of these partners on numerous other projects. So it was a very beneficial project. So looking a little closer at it, this is that highway, and that yellow pin is where the dam was located. This is an image of the dam looking upstream on the downstream side. So you can see that's an obvious fish passage barrier. And there was no sidewalk along the highway, so it was not a safe place. There was no other trail to get across through the town, across the river. So safety was a big issue. Upstream, this is looking at the reservoir standing on the road. There were really no water quality benefits, no benefits here because the water quality is poor and there was poor fish habitat. So an aerial image, the blue circle is indicating the location of the dam and showing you the upstream, that reservoir. And here is the engineered, where the image showing the projected stream bed based on the historical evidence. And this image is right after removal, during that first year. You can see that the stream bed is pretty much following the old stream bed. And then here's an image of it this summer. So you can see the vegetation is filled in really well. When they constructed it, there were riffles that were placed throughout. And then on the downstream side, again, we have those riffles. And then a comparison looking at what that dam looked like prior to removal and now. The much better habitat for fish, and they can travel upstream, and the road's much safer, and now there's a walking path, sidewalk alongside. So since the benefits of this project were biological, we wanted to use the biology to show our success. So we needed to collect solid baseline data in order to show any changes. And our expectations were that removing the dam would allow both fish and mussels to move upstream. And we had to consider our goals and who these changes, who we would be reporting these changes to. As scientists, we're interested in maybe some of the finer details and the small minnow species and things like that, but the public is more interested in hearing about the more evident things like walleye, sturgeon, and how those changes may be affected. And then you have to look at your short-term and long-term goals. In addition, you don't want to kill all of the biology during your restoration, so a lot of practices went into place. Silt fences, flow drawdown of that reservoir, and things like that. So for the biology, we collected both fish and invertebrates from a site located about 3/4 of a mile upstream from the former dam. Fish were collected 3 years prior to removal, and invertebrates were collected for 4 years. You can see, again, the dam's located here. We had a downstream site where we were sampling, and then that upstream site. So one thing that we looked at were the mussels. If you're not familiar with mussel species, they're a great indicator of both water quality and connectivity. They can specifically inform us about whether or not fish are swimming upstream. If you're not familiar with the life cycle, they can't swim upstream on their own, and they travel on either the gills or fins of fish. And so if we were able to find certain species upstream, certain mussel species upstream, that would tell us if the fish were there as well. And so these pictures aren't actually from the Mud River. This is from the Red Lake River. So we did an assessment prior to removal. We had the Minnesota State DNR malacologist work with us and their team, and we did sampling both above the dam at 4 different sites, starting at that first site that was just upstream all the way to the reservation boundary. And the catch per unit effort of the mussels, or the CPUE, was the lowest on the entire reservation, which isn't entirely, we weren't surprised because that dam was located so close to the mouth of the lake and was preventing fish passage. On the flip side, below the dam, at one site, we had 274 total mussels, and that was the highest catch per unit effort on the reservation, and actually at the time the malacologist for the state had said that was the highest he'd seen in the state. I just want to draw your attention to the 3 species in red, those were only found below the dam. And specifically, the pink heel splitter, though it's not endangered or threatened as a species, it's of particular interest in this project because we did find it downstream of the dam, and it relies on a specific host species, the freshwater drum or the sheephead. So we figured if we would find the drum upstream, eventually we will find pink heel splitters upstream as well. And that would provide evidence of not only improved fish passage, but restored ecology within the system. Then moving to the biological results for fish, before removal for 3 years, we found only 6 species, some of which were small minnow species. Post-dam removal, the 2 years after, that jumped to 20 species, which was a dramatic increase. And here I'll just draw your attention to the 3 species in red. Burbot as a sensitive species that we were able to find that upstream. Walleye is important to Red Lake, and then the freshwater drum, which was the host for the pink heel splitter. So we were pretty excited when we found this in that first year. We don't expect to see mussels immediately, but at some point we will be able to find those pink heel splitters upstream. So I won't go into any crazy statistics, but just this is a pretty obvious change in the fish community. The red bars are pre-dam removal and the blue bars are post-dam removal. You can see a significant increase in the fish IBI scores. That red horizontal line is the threshold for northern streams for general use. But this river is a borderline northern stream, northern headwater, and that threshold is 42. So if you're looking at that 2014 and 2015 data would actually be considered okay. And this was just the first year and second year after removal. So the fact that it improved that much was rather encouraging. Invertebrates, not as drastic of a change, but there was improvement in taxa richness. That was the 2 years after removal in 2015. So was it a success? As far as mussels go, that's unknown. They're a long-term That'll be a long-term project, but the host species was present, so that's a good indication that we should expect to see them in the future. The fish species went from 6 to 20, and those IBI scores were improving. And the invertebrates, we had an increased taxa richness. So now I'm going to shift over just to touch base on some of the other projects in the Mud River. So after that initial dam removal, we did an assessment of all of the culvert, stream crossing and culvert inventory of all the watersheds, sub-watersheds on the reservation, and found quite a few problems. And so here, this first one that I just talked to was this dam removal that occurred in 2012. And then we had an additional culvert replacement in 2018. There was one in 2019, and then a big stabilization project in 2019 as well. So here is that one that occurred in 2018. You can see the culvert, the fill material here, it's like a sugar sand, so every year it was washing away, or every time there was a storm event or a heavy rain. So this culvert was replaced through funding from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. But sometimes unexpected things happen, and in this case, the contractor drove a front-end loader across and crushed the culvert, and so a concrete pad had to be installed, and they said that would maintain the structural integrity of it. And so post-construction, we have a nice new set of culverts, stream channel, looking much better. This is from this year, 2021. We don't have those scour pools or ponding like we did before. This is the project at the boundary. We had problems with ponding upstream, scour pools downstream. This project received EPA 319 funding through a competitive grant, and you can see a much improved road. This is the image downstream. Things are improving, but sometimes nature has its own plan, and we were a little disappointed to go out and see that the pond was back this year, but after many, many years of there being an upstream reservoir, basically, from this site, the beaver was unhappy, and he's built his dam, but we still have water flowing through. So then the other watershed, we've got Pike Creek. This was an additional one where we've done 4 different, have been completed or will be completed projects. The first one here, this was at the boundary. This was probably our worst site as far as the washouts that would happen. You can see those culverts are crushed, very small in size for this stream. The road going in washed out every spring. That's what it looked like. And so this one, we applied for a competitive 319 grant, and were successful. So in 2017, the restoration for this site occurred. You can see much improved road, that stream channel, and here is the site in 2021. This was a project that we didn't actually complete. This is another site on the highway that goes through Red Lake. So the State of Minnesota Department of Transportation, as well as the Red Lake Roads Department, had to redo the road in this area. So this used to be a culvert. Unfortunately, I don't have before pictures, but it was a perched culvert, and so it was a definite fish passage barrier. And then last fall, they completed the work for this site. And when they did it, they did install some riffles throughout the downstream side. I can't remember. I think there were 15 or so maybe that were installed. This is another site that we received EPA 319 competitive funds for, and this is another one that has a lot of problems. You can see that fill material for that road is not adequate. So that's been a big part of all of these projects, is having engineering come in and do proper plans and and grade these appropriately. And so this one is actually, construction will begin in the next month or so to do this restoration. And we have one more. This is, again, another on the Pike Creek. You can see that it's a fish passage barrier, and sometimes more significant depending on whether it's a drought year or time of year. This is another 319 competitive grant that we received, and this one, the construction will begin in 2022. So just some final thoughts. This is a long process. It's taken over a decade to complete all of these projects on these two rivers that flow through the reservation. So it wasn't completed all at once. We've taken it piece by piece. It does require annual assessments. We check to make sure that the banks are staying stable. Bioassessments happen on a recurring basis, but our final result is restored connectivity throughout both of these watersheds. And with that, this is at the Mud River, that restored reach, but I can take any questions if there are any.
Thank you, Kayla. I don't see any questions in the box just yet for Kayla. Or Alice, I'm sorry, Kayla. You might check your chat box, make sure you don't have any questions in that. And also, again, if anybody has questions after the fact, you can email them to me or Chelsea, and we will be sure and forward them on to the presenters. Did you have any questions in your chat box, Kayla?
Nope, I do not have any.
Okay. So we'll give everybody just a couple of more minutes just in case. But while we're waiting to see if anybody has any more questions, I wanted to just mention that the next session will start at 10:30, and it's the environmental topics session. So everyone be sure and join us for that one. I don't see any questions, so if I receive any after the fact, I'll be sure and forward them on to you guys. So thank you, Katie, Allison, and Kayla. Thank you so much for joining us today and presenting. And thank you to everyone for attending the presentations this morning. And join us back here at 10:30. So everyone have a good day. Thank you.